Hey, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. This is BIA Kelsey Live. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your co-host, along with Mike Boland, our chief analyst. Hey, Mike, how are you doing today?
I'm well, Mitch. How are you?
It's a gray and kind of cold day here in the Northwest, but an awful lot going on in the world of local media and marketing to
There
talk
is.
about. So let's jump right in. Uh, First off, Foursquare. Foursquare announced yesterday that they're going to open a data location intelligence service. It's called the Pilgrim SDK, and this is basically a tool that allows developers to query the Foursquare database to create the next step recommendation for a shopper who's out on the street.
Yep.
What do you think of this? You've been tracking this market for a long time, so right
Yeah,
move?
this kind of takes some explaining in like the background. So yes, you're right. Foursquare launched the Pilgrim SDK.
Hmm.
So to explain that, it's essentially taken the Pilgrim functionality that so far has powered its own apps, so Swarm and Foursquare, and it's now offering that to third parties. And the important point is that this follows an important theme for Foursquare that we've written about in the past, which is that it continues to transition into a location data company as opposed to a consumer app that is ad supported. And that
Hmm.
lets it focus on what it does best, which is unique location data, and I'll circle back to that in a second. But to scale that capability far beyond the usage metrics of its own two apps. So that
Right.
previous strategy sort of inhibited Facebook because its success was tied to how many people use its app and how much ad inventory that represented. And that was really kind of a ceiling on its growth. So becoming a
Hmm.
data provider gives it really kind of unlimited growth potential to power the location functionality of others. And some of the other functions it's done that with, again, this follows in a long line of similar moves, include Pinpoint, which is its location targeted marketing platform, and its
Hmm.
place insight platform that it uses to track all kinds of foot traffic and glean insights for things like equity analysts that are looking for retail patterns and all
Right.
kinds of other things. And it also has an attribution engine and a places database that's used by Apple Maps and others. So that's the backdrop. Pilgrim
Mhm.
specifically is the functionality within Foursquare that you may have already seen that tracks kind of where you're going, where you stop, and things like new
Mhm.
cities that you go to. So if you're a Foursquare or Swarm user and you see those push notifications that say, I see you're at San Francisco Airport, try the steak
Right.
sandwich at Perry's, that's Pilgrim at work. And what makes this unique is, what Foursquare always refers to when I talk to them as the ground truth data. And what they mean by that is that, they have a combination of one check-in data from
Mhm.
Swarm and also what they refer to as stop detection that runs in the background. So the app essentially knows when you stop at a place for a certain amount of time, and then they count that as a visit, which is a lot more accurate than measuring like all the places you walk by, which is what a lot of other ad networks do and ad tech players when they claim to have all that location data. And
So,
then lastly, I'll just make this one last point.
yeah,
Sorry,
sure.
Mitch. Through having 11 billion check-ins over the last 8 years, it's built a pretty solid place database that's tied to a location graph. So it's not just measuring lat longs, but it knows that the place you stopped at is like the Dunkin' Donuts and not the McDonald's next door. So I
Right.
think that kind of positions it uniquely in just kind of how it's set up.
And to your point about dwell time,
Yeah,
that's the analogy that we're talking about.
exactly.
Just
It's a
like
good
you
way to
spend
put it.
time on a page,
Yes,
right?
good
So
way to
there's
put it.
dwell time at a place.
Yep.
And so as we start to understand where we go and where we pause, which I think is really the more interesting data, the fact that we're moving across town doesn't say much
Yeah.
except the range of probable places you might go. But once you are in a place and
Yeah.
spending time, it suggests a tremendous amount of potential next step kind of recommendations. So now the other thing, and you hit on this briefly, is that this opens up the opportunity for developers to take all of this data and to my Mac is dying, uh, and use that in apps of their own to be
Yes.
creative with those combinations of data. Do you think that Foursquare has opened up enough of the API from all those different services to really make that a profound tool for an independent developer to create some value with?
Yeah, and I think that all of the different, like, disparate little platforms I mentioned, Pinpoint and Place Insights and now Pilgrim, those aren't necessarily things that you have to use all of them, but some, apps will pick and choose. They'll apply some of those, some combination of all of those will apply differently. And I think it's interesting. So with Pilgrim, right now, the difference between that and the other things they've released are those other things are now just kind of open. You can just grab them and use them. Pilgrim, I think, is launching or soft launching with a certain amount of app partners. And it's interesting. So one of them is SnipSnap, which is a coupon provider. And the use case that they are kind of thinking might be valuable is that, by having all that data, the stop detection, all of that, they'll know that someone stops at a store for which either a coupon is available or it's one they've already saved. And the cool thing there is that the way that mobile coupons always seem to fall apart is in the redemption. And people either forget to use them or they don't know how to access them on their phone, and it's just kind of too much trouble. This might be kind of a trigger for you to use it and deep link exactly right to the coupon. So it's stuff like that I think third parties are going to be able to solve long-standing problems with just a unique kind of location trigger that they didn't have before.
So you could present a coupon that expires in a few minutes as you arrive at a place you frequently dwell.
Yeah, exactly. And it'll be able to deep link and tell you all of that stuff by, just the virtue of the depth of the data.
Well, it sounds like they're making the right move.
I think so. I think unlocking it, again, it goes back to that theme of just like using that core competency of Foursquare to, instead of powering its own apps, fan it out into the world and monetize it in that way. And it just allows the company to scale so much greater.
Well, there's another company out there that's having a little more trouble than Foursquare.
Yeah. So, it's interesting. The world has probably seen a lot of the headlines where, Uber is in a tailspin from a PR perspective. And that includes all kinds of things like footage that was caught of Travis Kalanick kind of chewing out a driver. That had a lot of kind of bad PR and implications. Plus, there's been some kind of gender discrimination issues. So, Mitch, you've been following this pretty closely. So,
I think February was the worst month in the history of Uber. It started off with the confusion, I think, really was what it was at the JFK airport with regard to the immigration ban, which led to Travis Kalanick's resignation from President Trump's Board of Economic Advisors or Business Advisors. That and all of the controversy around Trump got stuck on Uber. And I think that's understandable, and that kind of stuff happens, and companies move on. But then they went on to find that their senior vice president of engineering had a long history of sexual harassment, and that he had not disclosed that, so he had to leave. Then there was the revelation of a programmer at the company of rampant sexism and her own experience of it. And then finally, on the 28th day of the month, Travis went forth and got into a car and got into an argument, which the driver recorded using his dashboard cam, about the business decisions he'd been making. And amongst other things, he denigrated the workers' willingness to sacrifice to make money. Now, individually, all these things are, especially in Silicon Valley, pretty much par for the course. Yeah. I see a lot of stories saying the Uber case may be a bellwether or a key moment in history in terms of sexism in the Valley. I've heard that many times before. I don't think that necessarily is the case.
Everyone's on high alert for that right now in the Valley.
Right. Well, but they always are, and exactly. They always seem to get away with it. Mm-hmm. So the real problem here is that Uber has to raise more money. They are getting to the limits of their current cash position. Mm-hmm. They probably have $3.5 to $4 billion in cash or access to that cash.
Yeah. But it's a capital-intensive business. We'll specify
absolutely.
That.
Yeah. And they lost $3.5 billion last year.
Yeah.
So they are down to really $500 million in wiggle room, and they may have spent that already. We don't know. So they either have to do an IPO or they have to do a raise. The raise is going to be almost impossible at their current $62 billion valuation.
They dug themselves in a hole with the valuation they've got themselves to at this point.
And their leader, who has said, I need help, I need to grow up, is not the person who's going to be able to raise that money now. Now, they had a brilliant CFO who went back to Microsoft, who did the original round of all of the rounds of all these major raises. And I think it's going to be very difficult for Uber not to have a down round after this.
Yeah, interesting.
Now, a couple of things are going to tell us whether that's true. One is Lyft, their main competitor, Uber's main competitor, came out yesterday looking for $500 million in funding at a $6 billion valuation.
Yeah.
That looks a lot more attractive than Uber today. Now, if they have trouble raising, I think Uber has no potential to raise. If Lyft can raise, and at that valuation, Uber can raise, but on a down round.
Yeah.
On the other hand, Instacart also showed up today looking for $400 million in funding after saying they would never need any more funding. Now, is this an attempt to take some money away from Uber that they think is going to break loose from the money allocated to Uber? Maybe, maybe not. But these two raises are going to tell us a lot about the current VC appetite for on-demand.
Yeah, absolutely. And the timing is pretty clear. You have Lyft and Instacart really jumping on the opportunity with all this negative PR surrounding Uber. And I think it's interesting. I mean, I kind of have two minds about this. One, I agree with everything you said, especially the finances. You can't argue with those numbers in terms of its trouble. Essentially finding funding at its current valuation. A down round might be necessary just in terms of the finances. In terms of the PR stuff, I'm less convinced that that's going to have a long-term effect on the company. I think those are the types of things that blow over. I think investors, I think drivers, and I think consumers, all of which are in this equation of continuing to use Uber, continuing to drive for Uber, or continuing to fund Uber. It comes down to the unit economics, the strength of the business, the potential for future cash flows, and less of, if the CEO is a misogynist, or if he's creating a culture of misogyny and all these other things.
Or just a jerk.
Yeah, or just a jerk. I think that's fine, and that makes, sexy headlines and link bait and all these things. And I don't want to downplay these issues. These cultural issues are serious. But I think in terms of these decisions by investors, by drivers, it really comes down to the numbers. And the PR stuff, I think eventually, it might have a blip on in terms of how it affects these decisions, but ultimately these are numbers-based decisions. And I think that it can make up for that, and can is the operative word. And, we don't know the answer to that yet.
Well, so I think it's important to listen to the drivers.
Yeah.
The customers are the ones who will continue to show up. We know there's a delete Uber movement, but I think that will, like many things, pass. Social media campaigns often end up petering out. But the drivers are the key to their ability to make money.
They're supply constrained. I think it's a supply-driven marketplace, and that's where it starts.
And so I think Travis should have done a better job of listening to one of his customers with that driver who, as a driver in the role of driver, was out of line probably to speak to his rider that way. That would have been a firing offense for any other Uber driver. But of course, he was talking to Travis Kalanick. Travis needed to be a bigger person in the backseat of that car. Yeah. Because what it was seen by many drivers as was trickle-down prosperity. Yeah. And I've seen that in several of the reaction articles from drivers. It's kind of like, well, you cut our fees 3 times last year. You tell us you had to do it, but you're the one making the money, and we're not.
No, absolutely.
And that's going to hurt them compared to Lyft, who has focused on making the driver's experience better than Uber.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's going to have to recover from this in the ways that I said it might recover, it might not. It's going to have to recover using its checkbook by either sacrificing some of its margin for drivers, and something like that is going to have to happen for it to prevent an exodus of drivers. Because you're right that is one of the key points here, is whether or not it can still appeal to drivers, because it is a supply-driven marketplace. I think the users, the demand is a constant. The supply is where the magic is.
Well, I think On-Demand 1.0 too was very vertically focused in terms of what it delivered. And what we know now is the workers need multiple gigs, and they need a convenient way to move between those gigs. When you drive for Uber, you drive for Lyft, you're doing one thing. You might do other jobs.
Deliver food.
And so, or lawn mowing or massage or any number of personal services. And I think that On-Demand 2.0 will have tools for mixing gigs rather than doing one kind of gig.
Oh, yeah. Like a CRM system for an on-demand worker that helps them schedule and get paid and all that. Yeah.
And there are several examples of that, like WorkWave out there, who are doing that in individual service businesses. But we'll see in 2.0 a convergence of all of these things that are currently actually server-client kind of engagements between two community sets to peer-to-peer. Now, that might happen through something like the Arcade City platform, but I don't see them making a lot of progress. I think this is going to come from a more commercial solution.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So now the last one that we wanted to talk about today is YouTube and YouTube TV. The idea that YouTube is now going into the business of being your television carrier. They're offering a $35 a month service. That service will include all the broadcast channels and some of the major cable channels. What we know is that Time Warner and Viacom, who strangely happen to own cable systems, are not interested in sharing their content with YouTube. So you don't get the full offering of what's on TV, but for $35 a month, you get everything on TV and sort of an infinite DVR.
Yep.
Does it sell?
I think so, and this is why. I think, the world has caught on to the virtues of cord cutting and unbundling, and I think this is the latest blow to cable companies who, frankly deserve it, and I won't go too much into that. I'm kind of biased as a card-carrying cord cutter since 2009. But even in that kind of cord-cutting world, there was kind of a gap. So I'll use myself as a use case example. So I use Netflix, Hulu, HBO Now, and things like that for kind of premium content. And I have an antenna, digital antenna, to get all the local channels. And there's always kind of been a gap at that like basic cable level with like the ESPNs and FXs of the world. And I think that this fills that gap nicely. Now there were already gap fillers there like Sling TV, but I think that companies like Sling TV had a problem because they don't have much of a brand. Their technical muscle was kind of shoddy. It experienced some quality control issues. But when you look at YouTube, the marketing muscle it has, the customer education it can do, and really the stronger brand that I think people will trust in a decision to cut the cord, and again, kind of filling that middle ground. Now, there are a lot of other nuances to this, like some missing channels, as you mentioned. Viacom and Time Warner are both not included, so that doesn't include Comedy Central, CNN,
MTV.
Turner, the Turners.
MTV.
And MTV, yeah. So I think, but besides some of those details and how they integrate advertising and revenue share, that's all part of this. At a high level, I think this is something that should be scaring cable companies because, it's not new, but it's something where a very deep-pocketed and technically savvy player like YouTube is now in the mix.
Well, and I think because they have everything else on YouTube in addition to the TV channels, and that now they are actually in relation to one another through a single interface, is also a particularly important thing to keep in mind because it allows you to do more omni-channel placement across those various channels, including all the things you just watch on YouTube that are not true TV.
Now, that begs the question, if they come out with kind of, I imagine it's going to be multi-channel, it's going to be web, mobile apps, OTT boxes like Apple TV and Roku and Amazon Fire, if those apps are going to include, the TV channels and be very focused in that, or if it's also going to, incorporate a YouTube experience to watch like cat videos and, whatever, UGC stuff.
My feeling, and this goes back to a speech that Clay Shirky gave back in 2009 about the convergence of various media, and he was talking particularly about how media competes in political campaigns. But when you bring all this stuff into one interface, it becomes interchangeable from the user's perspective, and they start to treat it differently, which means, in some sense, the TV shows are going to be downgraded in terms of the authority they get because they're going to be right next to all the stuff that comes from anybody on the planet. Yeah. And that's a really interesting challenge, but it creates lots of new advertising opportunities across those channels.
That's exactly right. The retargeting they can do, which YouTube currently does in terms of both advertising and like what to watch next when you are signed in. If you're signing into this new environment with your current YouTube credentials, which I can't imagine they wouldn't do. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. The ability to do a lot of that kind of cross-channel stuff and programmatic advertising you mentioned earlier becomes greater because now you have this massive network effect of just content from these two big buckets and tied together with the same user. It's an interesting prospect.
So what we need to do is get these guys on and have them talk about how the local market, the SMB, the agencies in the local market are going to be able to use this many-channel approach to video. I think it'd be a fascinating conversation.
Oh, yeah.
I'll make a couple of calls. I think we're going to see another generation of what was recently called the unskippable ads coming out from Amazon or from Google in the next year or so, and watching how they start to encourage people to do content marketing rather than interruptive advertising will be the other really fascinating element of this experiment.
Oh, I think so too. Yeah, the ads are gonna how the business model builds around this, in not just the overall story of how it kind of accelerates cord cutting. I mean, that's kind of what interests me, but I think also, how they incorporate advertising, how they target it, what the consumer appetite for different formats of ads are going to be in this kind of new venue. I think it's going to be fascinating to watch, and all of that is still kind of open ended.
Well, we'll be talking about it on the blog and keeping up on it with the research reports that we've got coming out. By the way, we just released a new data purchasing research report last week that was sponsored by Database USA, so you can download that for free at our site. Go to blog.biakelsey.com to check that out. And, of course, we have lots of blog postings every day about local media and marketing. Check it out. Folks, we'll be back next Thursday. We have Charlie Wong, who is the founder of Josephine, a company that has actually started to influence California public policy in favor of home cooks trying to sell services through on demand, on to talk about their political investments. So we're looking forward to having Charlie next week and having all of you back. Mike, have a fantastic weekend.
Thanks, Mitch.